Good morning. My name is Ryan Roth, Policy Specialist for ISPE. Welcome to day 2 of the ISPE conference. I will be your moderator today. We will begin with a special announcement from ISPE President Sam Reed. Sam?
Thank you very much, Ryan. I'd like to take just a moment to recognize one of our Indiana Engineering Achievement Award winners this year. The award recognizes products or projects recently developed in Indiana that are notable for their ingenuity, quality of design, functionality, energy efficiency, and/or improvement to the environment. Congratulations to the following professional engineers who collaborated on the White River State Park Amphitheater: Ann Luther, Bill Horton, Scott Rouse, and Terry Emery. The amphitheater was built in 3 months during the winter off-season. The White River State Park Amphitheater, which we'll know in the future as the TCU Amphitheater, consists of a 60-foot tall canopy covering 3,000 permanent seats and spans engineered to provide excellent lines of sight from every angle. The almost $30 million project required immense coordination and cooperation between the owner, the construction workers, the construction management team, and the design team to complete the project in time for the 2020 concert season. Yes, I said 2020 concert season. Unfortunately, COVID-19 necessitated the cancellation of the 2020 season, but concerts will return already here in June of 2021, and downtown Indianapolis will find itself home to one of the new iconic venues in Indiana. Congratulations to this team. Ann, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you very much. This is a great honor. And I really want to thank the team from FRP, which is Tori Emery, Bill Horton, and Scott Rouse. They were an absolute joy to work with on this project. I served as the owner's representative for the project, and this was the culmination of over 4 years worth of work. As you can tell by the picture, the structural engineering on this is an absolute marvel. And we had to phase the project in 3 different construction phases. Some of the things that were required for the canopy, which is complete and will be turned over to the owner next week, had to be done in, like, the foundations for the columns were put in during the phase 2 of the project. So it was intense coordination, wonderful design, and a marvel. And happy to accept this award on behalf of the White River State Park.
Congratulations to the entire team. Ryan, back to you.
Thanks, Sam. Indeed, congratulations. Reading through this, it was very impressive the way everyone was able to pull it off. Now, let's get started with our presentation, Professionalism and Ethics in the Practice of Engineering. Hang on a second. Here we go. I got to make sure I press the right buttons. Presented by Brock Berry, David Kish, and Vince Drinovich. Let's go over a few things before we begin today. First, there is no quiz requirement for attendees, for live attendees of this session. Those who watch it on demand will be required to take a quiz. All attendees have been automatically muted to avoid audio feedback issues. All questions will be held until the end of the presentation. To ask a question, please type it into the question box. I will read it aloud at the end of the presentation as time permits. You are responsible for keeping track of your own PDHs for this event with the certificate provided to you. You are eligible to earn PDHs by logging into a session for its duration. ISPE will be keeping attendee files on record for auditing purposes, and again, there is no quiz requirement for those watching this session live. With that, I will hand it over to Brock, Dave, and Vince.
Okay, hello there. I'm Vince Drinovich, Professor Emeritus at Purdue University, and today we're going to be talking to you about professionalism and ethics in the practice of engineering. We have 3 presenters today. I'll start off and turn it over to Dr. Brock Berry, who is director of the mechanics group at the U.S. Military Academy. And then after his presentation, we will move to Dave Kish to cover the NSPE and other codes of ethics as well as the Indiana law. The program is a brand new program and major revision from what we've done before. The disclaimer here, of course, is that you're listening to the speakers and they represent their own opinions on this and do not officially represent any other organization. And of course, the presentation is copyrighted. I'd like to acknowledge the Indiana State Board of Registration for Professional Engineers. You can see them listed. Robert Elliott from Purdue Conferences, and Darcy Bullock and Tim Pelfrey from the Transportation Research Program for hosting this presentation. There are handouts and a quiz. The handouts for the course include a copy of the slides, so everything you see, you'll have a copy of. And after the course, you will receive an electronic quiz and evaluation, which you must complete to confirm your attendance. And you will require a score of 70% to get the PDH or CEU credit for this course. We're also using that to get your feedback on the value of this course. Overview, we're going to look at the basis for making ethical decisions, spend a fair amount of time on the brand new ASPE Code of Ethics, look at the NSPE Code of Ethics, the NSPE Board of Ethical Review, a VER case search engine, which is very, very powerful. We'll look at the Indiana statutes and rules, how to report violations, and then the remaining portion of the course will be making value-laden decisions. And we have a very interesting case study to present to you. Okay, expectations. By the end of this session, you will know about the different types of codes, engineering codes of ethics, be aware of the Indiana statutes and rules associated with professional conduct, have a systematic process for solving ethical dilemmas, and then see the value of a professional technical organization in the engineering profession. Okay, ethical behavior. What is it? Well, it's a contract among affected parties. Early and at the most informal level, it's an unwritten understanding, which is agreed behavior among individuals. It's basically taught by our upbringing, a so-called gentleman's agreement. A written contract has more defined focus, and these involve the professional code of ethics, and those are established and administered by a profession. And finally, you have the law, federal, state, and local statutes and rules. And they're administered and enforced by officials, fines, and penalties. Okay, codes of ethics are established by member professional societies. There's examples of them here. We have the NSPE code and the ASPE code, which is brand new of this October of this past year. ASME, to give you another. Engineering, U.S. Military Academy. As you can see, BS from Rochester Institute of Technology, MS from Colorado at Boulder, PhD from Purdue University. It's at Purdue where I met him. Was working with him. I was on his committee and had a delightful time working him through his doctoral studies here. He has 10 years as a senior geotechnical engineer and project manager, a licensed professional engineer in multiple states, and he is very highly recognized, as you can see by these two awards here, by both ASEE, American Society for Engineering Education, and ASCE. The ASCE Code of Ethics was given a clean slate. It was a task committee formed by ASCE Board of Directors in 2018. It had 8 members, including a student. It started with a clean slate. They did extensive research. They consulted ASCE membership on multiple occasions, discussed draft code with multiple other ASCE committees. It approved by the Board of Directors in October of 2020. And now I will turn this over to Brock, who will explain the entire process. Please enjoy his presentation. I think you will. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Brock Berry. In this relatively short video, I'm going to speak about ASCE's new Code of Ethics. The outline for our discussion is as follows. I'll present a rationale as to why ASCE pursued a new code of ethics. We'll look at the committee membership, the charge presented to the committee, and the activities pursued by that task committee. We'll take a look at what specifically the new code provides, and then we'll walk through the new code content. The rationale for why ASCE pursued a new code of ethics can be boiled down to a series of 5 points. First item is that we were overdue for a comprehensive review. Recognize that ASCE was founded in 1852. Our first code was not created until 1914. Predominantly, that first code focused on business interactions between ASCE members. In 1974, we introduced what is now considered one of the most common phrases in any code of ethics, something along the lines of holding paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. It wasn't until the late 1990s that we looked at introducing the concept of sustainable development. Over the last few years, Canon 8 was introduced, and that focused on diversity, equity, and inclusivity. The reality is, it's been over 45 years since ASCE pursued a comprehensive review of its code of ethics. While edits have been made over the years, we do, as a professional organization, have an obligation to ensure that our code of ethics is reflective of our modern situation. To that end, we were well overdue for conducting a comprehensive overview. Our second point was that the model itself, that the canon-based model was used, is rather outdated. When the code was last revisited 45 plus years ago, the canon-based models were very much in vogue. However, most professional societies have moved away from canon-based models because evidence suggests that canon-based models do not associate well in value-based cultures such as the culture that we live in, where we place value on certain items over others, in which case a canon-based model does not work well. Third point is that the hierarchy between ethical responsibilities resulted in gray areas, in which an engineer is unable to determine which canon takes precedence over another. Point 4 in the rationale is American-centric language. The prior code used American-centric language that may not translate well to ASCE's increasingly global membership. Some terms simply did not have an equivalent translation in other languages or other cultures. ASCE's primary area of membership growth is international. The society will never meet its mission to be global leaders if our code does not translate or fails to resonate with our international members. Point 5 is antiquated terminology. Given that much of the language in the prior code was written before a large portion of the ASCE membership was even born, it is not surprising to note that many terms in the prior code are considered antiquated. Again, from a society membership standpoint, it is the student members and younger members that are showing growth. Having a code that fails to connect with the subset of our membership that represents the future of our profession is disconcerting. Accordingly, in October of 2018, the ASCE Board of Directors established a task committee and presented them with the following charge. The charge simply reads that the task committee on the Code of Ethics is charged with developing and proposing a comprehensive overhaul of the ASCE Code of Ethics. In support of that charge, 3 points were identified. First, that the task committee should approach the task as if they were writing a code for the first time. The intent of this expectation was to avoid potential bias that would be inherent in attempting to revise the existing document. Specific consideration was given to the idea of revising the existing code, but the board felt that preparing a new code was more effective. Point 2 was to identify concepts that are considered to be part of a civil engineer's moral compass and ensure that those were integrated into the new code. And point 3 was to create a code that incorporates those concepts in concise, readable, and modern language. I do wish to emphasize here the guidance for concise, readable, and modern language. The names of the 8 volunteer members of the task committee, along with the ASCE staff contact, are on your screen now. It is worth noting that when formed, the committee included a student member and multiple younger members, and further that 2 of the individuals listed on the screen, in addition to being engineers, are also attorneys. Now, writing a code of ethics is not a task undertaken by a single individual or even a small group, such as our task committee. It is a collective effort of the entire organization. On the screen now is a list of both internal and external organizations that the task committee engaged with in the process of writing, revising, and approving a final version of the new code of ethics. At multiple points throughout the process of writing, revising, and approving a final new code of ethics, the task committee engaged with individual members. ASCE consists of over 150,000 members worldwide. Opportunities were provided via websites for members to review and provide comment on various versions of the code. The task committee then went through every individual comment provided by every member along the way. In some cases, that resulted in generating over 1,300 individual comments that the task committee individually deliberated and considered. On the right-hand side of your screen, you see an interesting pie chart representing the age distribution associated with individuals that did provide comments on a particular version of the code. My intent in providing this image is to simply highlight, first of all, the wide range of members, as well as to also specifically highlight the percentage, roughly 25% of those that did provide comments were considered to be younger members, which represent the future of our profession. The task committee used 8 guiding principles throughout our process of writing, revising, and approving a final version of the code. Very briefly, those 8 individual guiding principles are, first of all, that the code need to be aspirational from the standpoint of inspiring its members. That does not mean, being aspirational, that the code is non-enforceable. The code begins with a credo, followed by a hierarchy system of stakeholders. The preamble portion of any code of ethics is considered to be non-enforceable, but the content below the preamble no longer becomes aspirational. The aspirational content is only found in the preamble. Item 2 was that the code needed to be empowering. You'll note that the code is written in terms of things that members of ASCE will commit to do to live and to perform their duties ethically. Nowhere in the code of ethics do we use the word not. It was important to this task committee to simply not provide a list of things that members should not do, because that's not considered to be an empowering form of language. Item 3 was a behavioral compass that was mentioned in the charge, and specifically we had identified ethical principles that all members must ascribe to and ensure that those are threaded throughout the entire code. Item 4, which is perhaps the most significant change in the newest version, is the use of a hierarchy. There's a series of stakeholders that are identified, and those stakeholders are listed in precedence, starting with the highest stakeholder in the first portion and then moving on down from there. This allows for removal of those gray areas that existed under the canon model. Item 5, again, moving away from a canon-based model towards a stakeholder model, allows the engineer to clearly articulate their responsibility to each individual stakeholder. Item 6 was the use of concise language. You're going to note that the new code of ethics is considerably shorter, but still covers the same important information. Item 7 and item 8 I tend to put together. That is universal language in modern terminology. As was noted, our largest portion of our membership growth is in international and younger members. It was important that the new code used language that is globally recognized, gender neutral, and connects well with our growing population. Again, part of that task committee charge was to ensure that the new code of ethics was in fact concise. As you can see from the data on the screen, we've moved from just over 2,000 words in the prior code of ethics to now 675 words, representing the entire new ASCE code of ethics. Not surprisingly, concerns were expressed that the new code, because it was shorter, might be an oversimplification and therefore not cover all the content that was contained in the prior code. A detailed crosswalk between the existing prior code and the new code indicated that in fact every single individual moral concept in the prior also serves to illustrate how important topics are threaded throughout the entire document rather than treated as standalone concepts. For example, the most recent update to the prior code was Canon 8, which provides statements regarding diversity, equity, and inclusivity. As critical as those concepts are to a healthy organization, they were only found in Canon 8 of the prior code, whereas in the new code, elements of diversity, equity, and inclusivity can be found in items 1F, 1G, 2B, 5D, 5E, 5F, and 5G. On your screen at the moment is the full ASCE Code of Ethics. While the text may be too small for you to discern at the moment, the intent of providing it on a single slide is to illustrate the concise nature of the overall document. Over the next few slides, I'm going to highlight on a section-by-section approach specific content in the code. However, I do wish to highlight that all members are obligated to adhere to the full code. They cannot simply stop after stakeholder 1. The hierarchy does not allow the member to pick and choose items they wish to follow. The member satisfies stakeholder 2 while also adhering to the items in stakeholder 1. It is only in the case of conflict between ethical responsibilities that the hierarchy truly comes into play, and in those cases, the hierarchy helps answer the questions that cannot be answered in the prior canon-based model. Note, the preamble includes the fundamental ethical principles that govern one's professional career. The preamble also states that individuals will commit to the highest standards of integrity and professionalism, and above all else, protect and advance the health, safety, and welfare of the public. The preamble explains the applicability of the code to all members, regardless of membership grade or job description. Therefore, it's an inclusive document. Finally, the preamble explains the hierarchical structure of the stakeholders and emphasizes that there is no priority of responsibilities within a given stakeholder, with the exception of item 1A. The first stakeholder and highest in the hierarchy is society. While each item is important, I will highlight a few items in this section. First of all, in society, you will find item 1A, as mentioned in the preamble. The engineer will first and foremost protect the safety, health, and welfare of the public. Item 1D, zero tolerance for bribery, fraud, and corruption in all forms. And item 1F, treating all persons with respect, dignity, and fairness while rejecting all forms of discrimination and harassment. The natural and built environment is the second stakeholder. In this section, the member will find item 2A, adherence to sustainable development principles, and item 2D, wise use of resources. The third stakeholder is the profession. Items to highlight here include item 3B, the requirement to practice in compliance with all legal requirements, and item 3G, the requirement to continue professional development. While those items may sound like licensure, in truth, they apply equally to the licensed and non-licensed engineer. Stakeholder 4 is clients and employers. Items to highlight here include item 4C, communicate regarding risks and limitations, items 4E, protection of proprietary information, and item 4F, work only in one area of competence. Finally, stakeholder 5 is peers. Again, while every item is important and required, I'll highlight the requirements for item 5B, proper attribution, item 5E, acting with honesty and fairness on collaborative work, and item 5G, supervision in an equitable and respectful manner. And that concludes my brief introduction of the new ASCE Code of Ethics. My contact information is on the screen, and I'm happy to discuss the new code at any time. Thank you.
So Brock, thank you very much. Appreciate the insight into the development of the new ASCE Code of Ethics. We'd like to jump forward now and talk a little bit about the NSPE Code of Ethics. And to begin, we're going to start off with the fundamental canons that are associated with NSPE Code of Ethics. And again, in contrast to what Brock shared, this is very much a canon-based code of ethics. So the first one says engineers in the performance and the fulfillment of their public duties shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. Again, something we heard Brock mention in his earlier discussion. Second fundamental canon, perform services only in areas of their competence. Third, issue public statements only in an objective and truthful manner. Act for each employer or client as faithful agents or trustees. Avoid deceptive acts. And finally, the sixth canon is really kind of an overarching one, and really talks about how we as professional engineers should behave. We should conduct ourselves honorably, responsibly, ethically, lawfully to enhance the honor, reputation, and usefulness of the profession. So the code of ethics goes further. It's got kind of a next section, which are the rules of practice. And the rules of practice are really based on the fundamental canons that we just saw. The only one that's missing is number 6. So you can see the language there. Each one of these 5 rules of practices, 5 rules of practice, has somewhere between 2 and 6 subsections that are associated with it. So for example, if you wanted to look at item 1, holding paramount public health, safety, and welfare, item B talks about approving documents that are only in accordance with recognized standards. If you wanted to dig down a little bit deeper into Rule 4, which talks about acting as a faithful agent for an employer or client, that's where you see an opportunity to discuss a little bit or to disclose conflicts of interest. So again, each one of these has a little bit deeper piece that's associated with it. We'll talk about the third section then of the Code of Ethics, which are our obligations as professionals. Brock mentioned the idea that ASCE has updated their code. All right, NSPE has done so as well. In fact, the last time we did an update was in 2019. That's where we added an item to section 1, item F, that talks about engineers treating other people with dignity, respect, and fairness without discrimination. There are several other sections. Actually, there are 9 of these. And really, and if you will, I'm going to jump back to that prior slide. There's kind of a hierarchy that's involved with NSPE's Code of Ethics. And what you look at is the primary obligation is to your obligation to the public. Secondary obligation is to the employer or client, and a tertiary obligation is to your fellow professional engineers or to other professions. So at least on this slide, what you're really seeing is kind of, if you look at items 2 and 3, you're really talking about focusing on the public and the obligation to focus on the public. Now, when you hit item 4, that's talking a little bit about the employer now. So you're seeing that secondary obligation come in as we jump ahead now to the next, or basically the 567 of the professional conduct obligations. You can see that it's talking about how you handle yourself with other professionals. For example, engineers shall not attempt to injure the reputation of other engineers to their detriment. So that's kind of how the hierarchy of these goes. And you can use that hierarchy to help you make decisions. Hopefully we'll have a case later on that will help clarify that a little bit more. But basically it's a way for you to sort of put these 3 or put the different aspects of the Code of Ethics together and to help you make a value-based decision that's going to come up with the best solution you can. And the ability to put those pieces together to be able to balance your obligations to the public, to your employer, and to other engineers really helps being able to integrate those aspects of the Code of Ethics really helps you make better decisions. And then the last 2 sections really professional obligations you can see here. So again, the total of 9 sections for professional obligations portion of the NSPE Code of Ethics. So the Board of Ethical Review, the NSPE Board of Ethical Review, is a panel of engineering ethics experts. And since 1954, it served as the profession's guide for ethical dilemmas. The board consists of 7 licensed members that are appointed by the NSPE president. And the purpose of the Board of Ethical Review is to render impartial opinions pertaining to interpretation of the Code of Ethics. So you had a chance to see the Code of Ethics. The Board of Ethical Review is a group that, on behalf of NSPE, takes a look at those and tries to apply them to cases so that individual members can understand a little bit better how they might use these in practice. The Board of Ethical Review also develops materials, conducts studies relating to ethics of the engineering profession. So Talk a little bit about Board of Ethical Review cases. What exactly does a Board of Ethical Review case look like? Starts off by listing the facts. Typically, it's a situation that you describe the situation at hand where there's an ethical dilemma. Next item is kind of a comparison. You can compare it to sections within the Code of Ethics or previous Board of Ethical Review case. I have an opportunity to demonstrate it, or at least to show an image of the search engine in a couple of slides. And that search engine is really useful to help sort through some of these prior Board of Ethical Review cases so that you can do the comparisons. So once you've identified those, there's a detailed discussion of the situation. You might look at how the various sections of the NSPE Code of Ethics apply, or maybe a discussion of how the prior Board of Ethical Review cases might apply to this particular situation they're handed with. And in the end, you come up with a conclusion, whether or not an individual is acting ethically or not. That's a simplified way to describe it. So I alluded to the idea that there's a number of resources that you can use and the Board of Ethical Review uses in the course of their work. One of them is a search engine that you can find by following the link that's at the top of the page. And what it allows you to do, if you want to go back, I think 1958 was the first Board of Ethical Review case. You can go back and look at every case or look at all the Board of Ethical Review cases since 1958. You can search by keywords, maybe things like conflict of interest or gift, or you can look at the different code sections and do some filtering there. There's also a nice study guide. You can see information about the study guide on the right side of the page. And it's got some nice steps to ethical decision and to making ethical engineering decisions. We've got a very similar format that we're going to talk about in the course of this presentation, but again, just a host of great resources available at the Board of Ethical Review. I'm going to shift gears now and talk a little bit about Indiana law and the practice of engineering. So it's covered by the Indiana Code. So on this screen, what you're seeing, anything that begins with IC talks about Indiana Code. IAC, Indiana Administrative Code, are rules associated with the board. I'll go into a little bit more detail there. But the Board of Registration for Professional Engineers was established by the legislature. It was established in Indiana, or it's established in IC 2531. The actual rules that the board implements are 864 IAC. And there are some overriding rules that apply to all professions in the state of Indiana. That could be architects, engineers, could be barbers, for example, but some items involving discipline for those various professions all exist in this reference here, IC 25.1.11.5. As we touch on engineers, the things that we're going to focus on primarily are the rules that exist in Rule 11. How exactly is it that the rules of the board are implemented? These rules that are established in IAC 864. So typically, a draft is created by staff, by the board, counsel to the board. Counsel is typically a representative of the Attorney General's office. So they create some draft rules, publish them, hold a public hearing where members of the general public are able to come, or the regulated profession for that matter, are able to come forward and make comments about the rules. Those are incorporated, and once that process goes through, sent forward to the Office of Attorney General for review, then to the Office of Management and Budget, finally to the Governor's office for his or her approval, or perhaps a veto. So I'm going to talk more detail about the rules of the board, in particular professional conduct. And we'll go over what I'm going to characterize as some administrative sections. So sections 1 and 2 are among those. Section 2, for example, is going to be very important for you to remember, because section 2 says that it's assumed the licensed engineer is knowledgeable of the acts and rules of the board, and the engineer agrees to abide by the acts and rules. Section 3 is where the rules indicate that the practice of engineering is a privilege, not a right. And finally, sections 24 and 25 talk a little bit about discipline for engineers. Conviction of a crime, for example, could be something that would, conviction of a crime is something that the board might want to consider if they need to discipline you. And not only is conviction of a crime, but for example, if you're being disciplined in another jurisdiction, another state, that may also have impact on your ability to practice sections are what I'll characterize as kind of administrative sections of Rule 11. The remaining 19 sections of Rule 11, I'm going to group into 7 categories. You can see the different categories listed here on the screen. For example, one of the primary things we saw not only in NSP's Code of Ethics, but in ASB's Rule of Code of Ethics, is the obligation of the engineer to hold paramount safety, health, and welfare of the general public. So you find that in Section 4. Information about an engineer's qualifications to practice, you'll find in Sections 5 through 7, also 20 and 21. Some of the language you'll see in there: engineers shall undertake to perform engineering assignments only when qualified by education and experience. Sections 9 to 11 give information about the kind of testimony we should give. We shall be completely objective. We shall be completely objective and truthful in all professional reports, statements, or testimony. Talks about conflicts of interest and when we have to disclose them. Sections 14 through 16 and also 19 talk about payments and gifts. Engineers shall not offer to pay any commission, political contribution, gift, or other consideration in order to secure work. Finally, we'll see that in Section 22 and 23, there's some language about not using an engineer's name in a fraudulent or dishonest venture, and also reporting violations. I should point out that much of the language in Rule 11 is shall, and sometimes I get a little bit lazy and use should. If you look at the language, make sure that I'm correct. In almost every instance, it says shall. So these aren't optional. These are rules that you shall follow. So apologize if I misstated those a little bit. So the last slide we saw was that there's an obligation to report violations. How do you do that in the state of Indiana? Well, it's codified in Indiana Code 25.1.7. And the Office of the Attorney General receives, investigates, and prosecutes complaints concerning regulated occupations. Complaints have to be written, signed by the person who's making the complaint, and they're initially filed with the director of the agency that regulates that particular profession. You have violations to report in other states. Take a look at the website that's at the top of this page. For example, it gives contact information for the attorney generals of the various states. Suppose you have a violation involving a federal agency that you need to consider. To file a complaint there, your first step is to contact the agency directly. The link on this page gives you an opportunity, or gives you a place where you can find contact information for those agencies. If for some reason you're not able to resolve that issue with the agency, you can go to the Inspector General of the particular agency and move on from there. Well, how do you know if you have an ethical problem? A lot of times you'll know it if you have kind of a queasy feeling in the pit of your stomach. You start rationalizing. There's a host of decisions or a host of phrases you can use if you're rational. You can say, oh, everybody does it. Another way you might know that you have an ethical dilemma is if you're faced with a situation and sometimes your first reaction is, oh crap, and maybe you'll use a little more aggressive term than crap in that case. So those are some of the things that might give you an, hey, I'm facing an ethical problem. So if you're in that, how do you go about solving it? Well, one way is to use ethical thinking. An organized, reasoned analysis of value-weighted problems. We'll try to outline some steps that are useful for making value-weighted thinking. Earlier, I talked about the fact that the Board of Ethical Review has some steps that you can go through. Back at before the turn of the century, in a class I believe Vince led, Civil Engineering 394, they came up with the steps that we'll go through here. First, you need to recognize that you have a problem. Once you recognize or realize that there's a problem, you need to define it, who's involved, who are the stakeholders, what kind of evidence exists. Identify options that are available. What are some things that can be done in order to resolve that ethical dilemma? Weigh the consequences of the various solutions that you come up with or the options that you've considered. A great way to help understand is to go back and look at cases, look at codes of ethics, look at cases in the Board of Ethical Review, and kind of compare and see what the codes of ethics or a case might tell you to help you make a decision. You can also go back and look at the law. You can look at probably Rule 11, at least in Indiana, is a really good place to start. Ask yourself, does it feel right? Would you like this particular situation to be publicized on the news at the end of the day, or would you like to appear on the New York Times? That's going to help you, know if you come to hopefully a good decision and let you know what you're up against. Always important to ask someone else. Sometimes we can get so involved in trying to solve a problem that you don't see the forest from the trees. And sharing with somebody else is a good way to maybe get some other opinions. So it's an important step to take. Once you do that, choose what to do. And after you've made the choice, act on it, and then learn from the experience. So now we've had an opportunity to review not only the ASC Code of Ethics, NSC Code of Ethics, and we've looked at Indiana rules and laws. Let's try to apply those to the case study. So in this case, we'll call the case the Discoverer of Margaritaville. We'll follow a little bit of some of the steps that are involved in the Board of Ethical Review process, and we'll start with some facts. So Kish, can't even say my own name. Kish Engineering is selected by the authorities in the mythical country of Margaritaville to build the foundation and base for a statue of that country's discovery. Kish subcontracts with Vince Renovich to assess the soil on which the foundation will be constructed. While reviewing documents that Kish shared with him in confidence, Vince learns Kish contributed to a fund established past the statue of Margaritaville discovery. Now, it's common practice in Margaritaville for people to leave gifts, sometimes they're called tips in that region, in consideration of better service in the future. So the questions we have, has Kish acted ethically? And if Kish is not, what should Vince do? So we went through the value-weighted decision, or the value decision-making process. So, the first thing we talked about is decide whether or not either Vince or I have a problem. You have to define what the problem is. Who's paying for the project? I think our initial assumption on this is that somehow we're involved in a situation where something was wrong with a gift. But there could be a host of situations that you might enter into where it would be acceptable to give a gift. If part of the consideration in this case was that the discoverer of Margaritaville decided that he wanted Kish to do the project, it may not be a problem at all. So you need to really go through and think through the problem to see if there is an issue there. What's the relationship between Kish and his owner? Again, in this case, it could be that the relationship was that I said, hey, I'm going to do this for you for free, and that's how I get the job. So what are the options that are available? Is there an ethical problem? From Vince's perspective, if he finds, if he believes that there's a problem with what I did, the great thing to do is to come forward and to talk with me and say, hey, I think there's a problem. He also should talk with others to try to understand what options might be available to him. And then finally, check with codes of ethics in the law. And in this step, checking with codes of ethics in the law, we'll try to apply some of the decision-making processes that we just went through. So let's start with the ASCE Code of Ethics. And with the question of, have I acted ethically? In order to make this easier, let's go with the assumption that I did not. So in that case, what should Vince do? What should Germovich do? And we found that there are several ASCE code provisions that apply here. One is obligations with respect to society. And we think those are D, G, and I. What are your obligations with respect to the profession? Those are outlined here as A, B, and D. And finally, obligations with respect to clients and employers. That's A, B, and E. So here we see those. Particular sections of the code laid out. So, for example, with respect to society, we should have zero tolerance for bribery. So if I acted improperly, looks like I paid and made a gift in order to have this work done, having zero tolerance for bribery speaks to that. Acknowledging the diverse historical, social, and cultural needs. So conceivably, I might try to argue and say that, hey, in Margaritaville, it's okay, everybody gets tips, so it wasn't a big deal for me to give this gift. So those are some of the kinds of things that you might want to look through. With respect to the profession, engineers have an obligation to uphold honor, integrity, and dignity, and practice in compliance with legal requirements in the jurisdiction of practice. So, for example, if we were in Indiana, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but Indiana law would have something to say about giving a gift to secure work. And then finally, rejecting practices of unfair competition. So have I put myself at an advantage by giving the gift? Finally, engineers, the third idea that Vince might want to look at, engineers in their obligation to clients and employers need to keep clients and employees identified proprietary information confidential. So conceivably, Vince could be faced with this bad situation where, I gave him information about what I did, this gift I gave him confidence because he had an obligation to not report that. And I think the nice thing, and Brock did a great job of explaining it, the hierarchical nature, I guess I'll characterize it as ASCE's code of ethics, would suggest that the obligation to society came first. And that would kind of help overrule any objections I might make to saying, hey, you shouldn't be able to take this forward, Vince, I told you this in confidence. Let's jump on then and move to apply the NSPE code of ethics and see how those might apply and how that might work with this particular case at hand. You can look at the rules, the areas that we identified that would apply to this particular case. Rules of practice for Canon 2, so item C, also professional obligations 1, 3, and 4. We'll go into a little bit more information about those here. So again, a situation that Vince is faced with, again, we're assuming that I did something unethical. Vince is faced with the idea that he shouldn't reveal facts, data, or information without the consent of the employer, except as authorized or required by law. So I gave him some information in confidence. So this could speak a little bit to the situation he's faced with. For professional obligations, engineers should be guided in all their relations by highest standards of integrity. Again, language that speaks to not disclosing confidential information that's obtained in the course of business. So that might present a bit of a conflict for Vince because I did, again, give him this information in confidence. Whoops, let me jump back a little bit. So again, one of the items that we talked about when we went over that NSPE code of ethics is kind of the hierarchical nature of the code. And the idea that you have an obligation first to the public. Second obligation is to clients, employees, and third is to other professionals. So if you look at what I'm faced with, although it would, or the situation Vince is faced with, although it would appear on the surface that I gave him information in confidence, an overriding goal that he should be thinking about is the fact that it was done in apparent violation of the law, and it's not in the public's best interest. So that would help kind of overrule any reservations he might have about information that was obtained in confidence. Finally, let's take a look at this case and look at what might happen if we applied the rules of the board in Indiana. So specifically, Rule 11. If you wanted to look at whether or not I acted ethically, Section 19 speaks to that. Very specifically, it says payment in consideration to secure work is prohibited. With respect to Vince, what do the Indiana rules say to that? Sections 12 and 13 talk about conflict of interest. So Vince has a bit of a conflict of interest. He's working with me, but nevertheless, he has an obligation to practice ethically. So he's got a conflict. One of the steps we listed that he might want to do is to come talk to me. So he ought to come talk to me and say that there's a conflict, and he ought to disclose to me that it exists. Section 19 again applies. He sees that I paid to secure work. That's something he ought to consider and recognize that that's not acceptable in the state. And then also for him, Section 22 applies. If he becomes involved with this, his name will be used in part of the violation. He'll be used in fraudulent or dishonest ventures, so he shouldn't do that. And then section 23 also speaks to how you go about reporting violations. Now, we didn't say anything on our list on how you go report a violation in Margaritaville. I don't think that any of the websites that we had necessarily give contact information for that jurisdiction. But nevertheless, reporting violations will be the next step in the process to address the wrong that I did. So in the interest of time, we tried to present a case that was somewhat fun, but also hopefully a little bit easy to look at. Although, you know, as we talked about some of the items that are associated with it, there was a lot we could have thrown in that case to make it a little bit more difficult. But ethical decisions really are tough. They're not always black and white. Often there's some shades of gray, and we even alluded to some of the shades of gray that exist in the case that we looked at before. Personal loyalties and feelings can be involved. You could conceivably have to have an issue that involves a close friend or a good professional associate. So certainly another thing that makes it tough. A lot of times you find yourself in a no-win situation where your job or your livelihood may be at stake. And you can have conflicting guidelines. I think we pointed out that there were some areas just in our simple case where different provisions of the various codes of ethics give guidance that, you know, kind of makes things a little bit difficult. So again, that's why ethical decisions are tough. So one way to help improve your ability to make those difficult decisions is to have some ethical health fitness. So you want to have a balance of physical, emotional, social, intellectual, economic, and spiritual health. And I think, particularly in pandemic times, that's very much the case. Take time to sharpen the saw. And we've got some information here that hopefully will help you sharpen the saw. A great way to do it, and we're sitting virtually amongst a group of our peers, other professionals, a place to discuss ethical issues we run into. And those are great ways to practice your ethical health and fitness. And it's important to remember that consistency in behavior and the small things we do really helps make decisions when you come face to big issues. If you're cutting corners on little stuff, sometimes it makes it a little bit easier for you to cut a corner if you're faced with a difficult situation. So I think consistency in your behavior, if you do things right, you do the small things right, you do the big things right too. At least that's certainly a hope. So where are some places you can sharpen the saw? One reference would be to the NCEEF Code of Ethics. So it's another opportunity for you to look at rules, codes of ethics, and try to follow and see what those have to say. It's also particularly important for those who are looking at the FE and PE exam, because the NCEEF Code of Ethics is a document for the model rules that are used to solve the problems that you'll see if you take either of those exams. NFPE has some practice ethics exams. You can see the link to them here. There's 25 true and false questions, and you can also check your answers to make sure that you're doing well. There are some other ethics references listed here. You know, we certainly talked about the idea of the search engine that NFP makes available to someone look through old Board of Ethical Review cases. That's great. And of course, the information that Brock has shared with us on ASCE's new code of ethics. Certainly would want to draw your attention to that and make sure that you have an opportunity to look at that and see how that's changed and how it applies to really some neat ideas that were shared with us today. So in summary, ethical behavior benefits everyone. It can be unwritten agreements that Vince talked about earlier. It can be codes that are established by professional societies. We've seen two of those today. It can also be statutes and rules. Hopefully we've done a good job of demonstrating that you can use the codes and statutes and rules to help resolve ethical dilemmas. When you renew a PE license, you acknowledge that you're familiar with the laws and rules and you agree to abide by them. And although we didn't necessarily touch on it, it's important to make note here that as engineers, we need to be aware of what the rules are for our company or the agency that we work for regarding gifts. Codes of ethics are essential for all professions. They don't exist only for engineers. Certainly our friends, the architects, have codes of ethics. Professional technical societies and licensing laws and rules determine the ethical practice of engineering. We suggest that it's important to use a systematic approach to resolve value-laden problems. You could use the information we shared from the course CE 394, also the problem-solving guide that's in the Board of Ethical Review study guide. So those are good tools you can use to help go through a systematic approach to try to solve problems. And again, would refer to the Board of Ethical Review, NSPE Board of Ethical Review, as examples of many ethical problems that have been faced basically since the first case in 1958. It's important to stay ethically fit. Hopefully, this presentation has helped give everyone's minds a bit of a workout. So we welcome comments and questions. We'll have some ability to see those coming in over the chat screen. So we'll be here to look at those.
Okay, it looks like that wraps up our video. Who would have ever thought a statue for Jimmy Buffett could be so complicated? David, Vince, Brock, if you guys want to, would like to take yourselves off of mute for a second. We have a few questions that have come in, and I know Brock answered one of them here, but I'll go ahead and read it out loud and see if David or Vince has any additional comments that they'd like to say. Has the ASCE code resulted in any change in the number or type of ethical issues brought to the Society for resolution?
At least from NSP's perspective, I don't think the board, I'm not aware of the Board of Ethical Review seeing any new issues coming as a result of changes from ASCE. Certainly members of the Board of Ethical Review are aware of the changes in the code and enjoyed looking at them. But we haven't seen new things, and I don't know if Brock has more info he'd wanted to share about that or not.
Yeah, certainly happy to respond to that question. It's a really good question. In fact, we typed a response in the Q&A, but I don't think that goes to the entire audience. But you know, one thing to clarify is when an issue is identified or a potential case is identified, initially that goes to the General Counsel for ASCE. That's a lady by the name of Tara Hoke, a wonderful individual. In fact, she was part of our committee that was involved with writing this new code. And she's the initial stopgap to identify and review these cases, collect the information. She does not adjudicate on those. She just simply collects the information and passes it to the ASCE Committee on Professional Conduct. That's referred to as CPC, Committee on Professional Conduct. And they're the ones that actually review cases, come up with a response, and determine if there has been, in fact, a violation of the Code of Ethics. And if so, what is the resulting penalty? Annually, that group does not field a lot of cases. I mean, that's probably a good news story. The fact that they probably deal with somewhere in the neighborhood of about a dozen cases a year. I did speak with Tara Hoke, the General Counsel, just last week on this topic, and asked since October, when the new code went into effect, has there been an uptick or a downtick in the number of cases? And she indicated that in general, the number of cases has not changed, which might be an indication that, you know, the way that the new code is being applied, somewhat equivalent to the way the old code was being applied. It certainly doesn't make it any less difficult or more difficult to identify a ethical dilemma or deal with an ethical dilemma, which I really think is the nature of the question. Is this new code making it any easier or any more difficult? So hopefully that addresses your question.
Okay. Well, I believe that is about all that we have time for this session. Again, Vince, David, and Brock, thank you very much for a very good presentation. And as a reminder to everyone, there is not going to be a quiz for this session if you are watching it live. So with that, the rest of you have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you at the next session.
It was great to be here. I enjoyed watching this again, I learned something from it, even though I've watched it several times earlier, and I certainly would recommend people to go back and review. There's a lot of golden nuggets of information in this presentation, and I thank Brock and Bruce for their tremendous contributions to the program.
Have a great day, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.